We want to alert you that some of the content you're about to hear in these podcasts could be upsetting and distressing. So please be aware this may not be the right moment to listen. In this chapter of Child Protection Committee Scotland's series of themed podcasts, we're exploring why people like you and me, might stay schtum instead of speaking up to report concerns that a child may be being neglected or harmed. We also wanted to find out what happens if we do tell someone that we're worried about a child or children. In this podcast, we'll also hear about multi-agency working, or to put it in plain English, how organisations and agencies work together to help keep the vast majority of our children safe. I started the podcast proceedings by asking our three guests to introduce themselves.
I'm Elaine Torrance and I'm the independent chair of the Dundee Children at Risk Committee, which is really the Child Protection Committee. But I'm an experienced social worker and I've been working in this field for over 40 years and have been Chief Social Work Officer in the past as well. So substantial experience in this area. Thank you.
I think you know what you're talking about. OK, next we have...
Hi, I'm Lianne Kelly. I am a Detective Sergeant in the National Child Abuse Investigation Unit based at Paisley. I've been a police officer for 25 years almost, and the last 13 years of that have been in reactive CID, public protection, so basically investigating sexual crimes and crimes against children.
Fantastic, another expert here. And finally, last but by no means least.
Hi, I'm Helen Westerman. I'm Head of Local Campaigns at the NSPCC. Been with the charity now for 18 years and basically work with a team who run raising awareness and behaviour change campaigns right across the UK, including Scotland.
Fantastic. So we've got an incredible wealth of experience around this table, and that's the point of this podcast, to exchange views, learnings to people listening to it and to each other. And by the way, I'll be the biggest learner here because I'm listening closely to what you're saying. And it is a big, serious subject. Why do we not report if we suspect abuse? And maybe we start with that very straightforward, or is it, term abuse, Elaine, because it can mean all things to all people. Can you give me your definition of what it covers?
Yeah, I think abuse is any harm that occurs to children and young people, and indeed to adults as well. It covers the whole spectrum. And there's various forms of abuse, and some people think of some forms but not others. So we have neglect. So if a child or a young person is hungry all the time, is poorly clothed, is looking, really unkempt, that could be a sign of neglect within that household. And of course, with the cost of living crisis, that might be a bigger issue for us at the present time. But there's also sexual abuse, which is probably more well known, sexual abuse to children and young people. But we also have emotional abuse as well. And that is something that's perhaps a little bit unknown or more unknown because young people or children who are not loved by their family, who are perhaps put down all the time, don't get the confidence and the love and affection that we really need. And that can cause some huge issues for them in later life. So there's a whole range of different kinds of abuse, some more in the forefront of people's minds than others.
So not as simple as just that one word would connote. And would you agree, Lianne, that you're a police officer, you're dealing with, I can only imagine, some extraordinary cases of abuse, but does that tally with your definition of abuse?
Yeah, it definitely does tally with my definition of it. Obviously in the police we're dealing with mainly physical abuse and sexual abuse, but certainly in the nature of business that I work in now, when we deal with adult survivors of childhood abuse in institutions, they do talk a lot about emotional abuse, neglect and things like that. So yeah, I would agree with all of that.
And Helen, for you, it's children you're looking out for.
Absolutely. And our school service, Speak Out, Stay Safe, often talks to children about sexual abuse.
Tell us a little bit about Speak Out, Stay Safe.
Speak Out, Stay Safe is a programme offered to every primary school in the UK free of charge, designed to educate and inform children from very young, sort of 4, 5, right through to age 11, obviously done in an age-appropriate way and not there to alarm, but to let children know the various forms of abuse, what that constitutes and where they can go, more importantly, for help and support. And we find that children know less probably about sexual abuse and neglect and a bit more about what constitutes physical abuse.
And that in itself can be quite complicated, can't it, Elaine, if they don't even know they are a victim of a certain sort of abuse?
That's right. I mean, we all live in families, and I don't think anybody really is clear what the norm is in families. So some things you might find or think are acceptable behaviours, but indeed they're not. So it's really important that we start to talk to children and young people, talk about their experiences, encourage them to be able to speak out to us as well, because I think that dialogue's really, really important.
Do you think they are speaking out more in your experience?
I think it's really difficult. I think some children do, and we go into a school and we'll get a disclosure on the back of the assembly or the workshop that's been given. For other children, they won't share. And we hear from adults, don't we, adult survivors of child sexual abuse particularly, who talk about not being able to speak up and the fear of speaking up. And that lives with them into adulthood and goes on to affect them in adulthood too.
Lianne, as the police rep here, we know that many people will hesitate and they will agonise maybe over reporting concerns about a child or children that are being possibly abused or harmed or neglected. Why? What are the reasons for that? I know I would feel a bit reticent about it, but what's stopping us? What's the barrier?
There are many reasons. In my experience, when I speak to people, when they finally do call the police or the social work department to report concerns, the number one concern, I think, is that their identity will be given to the family of the child that they're worried about, and they're worried about the repercussion for themselves and their own family. They're sometimes worried that they've got it wrong or they're overreacting somehow, and that if they do speak up, then that causes chaos in the family for no reason.
Is that a fair thing to think about, though? Because if you're not sure and you're thinking, am I reading this wrongly, or am I over-egging something that I've witnessed or I've heard, you are going to be very careful about throwing about accusations.
Very much so. And we had a case quite a few years ago where a young boy was being horrifically abused by his mother. But when I spoke to one of the witnesses who lived in the same street, she said to me, good parenting for me is subjective. She said, what I think is good parenting might not be everyone else's definition of good parenting. She said, so I didn't want to jump the gun and assume that this boy was being harmed. It turned out he was being harmed, and quite severely. So she did the right thing in calling us, but who knows how long she had been worried about that boy for before she came to us. So yeah, lots of reasons why people are reluctant to phone the police.
Elaine, you're kind of nodding along with that. That is a concern, isn't it? That you are very concerned to do the right thing, so you end up doing nothing because you're thinking that's probably the safest area.
I think what people also worry about the repercussions on the family and the child as well, or the young person that they're reporting about. And I think people can be reassured that actually all the agencies that are involved in child protection are first of all involved in supporting families, and very often if some concern is raised, we will go in and very proportionately work with that family, and often it's about support initially to that family, which can make such a big difference to people's lives. So it isn't about the Black Maria going in and taking children away. It's actually about going in, talking to families, talking to young people and seeing what we can do to make things better, because actually removal of children is very much the last resort and the very last, and it doesn't happen in many cases.
Helen, is it the same for the NSPCC? Because children, is it a case that adults will reports through the NSPCC lines as well?
We do get adults come to us, obviously, and every day thousands of children are protected by the very adults that see things in their community. So people are reporting, they are acting on their concerns. But last year we worked with YouGov on a poll that revealed that 1 in 5 UK adults who'd had a concern that a child might be experiencing abuse or neglect didn't take action. And a quarter of adults in Scotland said they had concerns about a child might be experiencing abuse or neglect. So a quarter of the population worried that a child that they know might be experiencing abuse and neglect. So we've got to get over that barrier to what's stopping people disclosing. And I get that's very perceived and real barriers, and we need to take that seriously.
How do we get around that then?
But at the same time, absolutely, educating the public that, if it's not you, then who? because you might be the only person that has seen what's happening to that child or know about it or hearing it if you're a next door neighbour or you're in a community organisation or whatever. So, thinking about you could be the only person that could help that child. And that's really important for us at the NSPCC. We've run a new campaign called Listen Up, Speak Up, encouraging the public to have some tips and advice on what to do if they have concerns. But we also run workshops in communities, in businesses, in sports organisations to talk to the public about the different forms of abuse, but also what to do when they are worried and why it's so important. So we give them a range of different scenarios.
Give us some tips then, right now.
So,
why not?
You're at a football match and a dad's at the side of the pitch shouting at his son, shouting at the referee, really expletive. And what would you do in that situation? You recognise that the child's struggling, the ref's obviously a bit worried about it. What do you do? And we would say, have a conversation with the club's safeguarding lead, really important. And they don't need to single that dad out, maybe. They bring in all parents and talk about how we can positively support children. We do that kind of gentle touch right through to what would you do if you were worried about a child being left home alone at 1-2 years of age? What would you do if an adult was intoxicated and couldn't look after a child? What happens if you were a member on the bus and 2 young people in front of you were showing pictures of themselves in the park with much older adults the night before? What would you do in these scenarios? And it's great because we start conversations with people that sometimes have already acted on concerns that they've had, and actually they're able to influence others that may be less.
That's a great campaign, but do you think it's well, let's ask you, Lianne, do you think it's reaching the public, this kind of message?
I've never heard of that campaign.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
Right.
So maybe it's not reaching the people that we're dealing with, or the people that I see when I scroll through the child protection incidents on our system. So no, it's maybe not reaching as many people as we would like it to, but it does sound like a great campaign. And
Elaine?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that you can report these incidents through a whole variety of means. And I think one of the strengths of working in this area is the multi-agency approach to this. We've got the police, we've got the social workers, we've got the health visitors, we've got the GPs all working together to try to support families. But also, when these things are raised, or when the public wish to raise things, you can do it in a variety of ways. So if you've got a child who's attending school, you could have a quiet word with the teacher and say, I'm a bit worried about that. I was in their house last night with my child and I just wasn't very happy about this that was happening. And again, they will deal with it in a proportionate way that will be able to follow that up. But you've got teachers, you've got your doctor, your local doctor you can talk to. You've got the social work department that you can find the contacts for that. And of course, if there's a real crisis, the police can be contacted, who are very good at getting involved very, very quickly and will prevent any further harm happening. So whole range of ways. And I'm not sure that people always understand that, who you can go to and how you can approach people.
I'm quite surprised, and is anyone around this table surprised, that we've had very topical recent cases. We've had the Glasgow abuse case recently, Sarah Sharif murder. All these things are on the news. They're informing us that we should be looking out for signs and looking out for kids. And yet there's still this reticence to come forward. I don't know who wants to take that one.
There's lots of different scenarios, I think, which pose challenges in terms of understanding and then being able to sort of pick up any concerns around that. So I think one of the things for me is the importance of professional curiosity, and that's not just about professionals. It's actually about the public. We can't keep children safe simply by professionals. We need to do it with the public and local communities. We need to be getting the word around so people can actually get involved in this. It isn't somebody else's responsibility. It is actually everybody's. And we need to get that message out really, really strongly.
Helen, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it is about changing that narrative from being seen to be dobbing somebody in to actually offering that family, that child, some help and support. Because, we're not just talking about people that are intentionally harming their children. We also might be talking about families who might be struggling, and by default, those children are being neglected. Things aren't quite right. So if we're getting in there early and being that kind of supportive friend, or as you mentioned, going to that teacher when you've got concerns about that child and doing it kind of gently, that may prevent things escalating, getting into crisis situations where then statutory services are having to be involved and children could be removed. But I agree, we're wanting to look at this as get your arms around a family in a metaphorical sense, really, to support families that might be struggling. Because when we did this survey last year, almost half parents said that there was some point when they're on their parenting journey that they did need help and support. Not necessarily professional help and support, but maybe from other community members, friends, family. It's tough being a parent and we don't always get it right. And sometimes that small intervention can really, really make a big difference.
We were speaking to adult survivors of child sexual abuse, and several of them said that adults that were not their abusers knew something was happening to them, but they did nothing. Now, I don't know. We all think we do the right thing, Elaine, but sometimes there's a blot there as well. Even when the abuse is extremely serious, adults who knew abusers were doing things are not opening their mouths. Why?
I would hope that if it reaches the professionals that they will intervene. But as you say, sometimes that we don't get that right either, in a sense of perhaps we haven't shared the right information, so there isn't a true picture of the situation that people can pull together. Although I think professionals and working together is really improving, and people are really working together to protect children as much as they possibly can. In the broader context, I think it's much more difficult to pinpoint why people aren't picking this up and doing something about it. I think that I do think it is about people thinking it's not my job to do this. You know, I'm a neighbour. It's nothing to do with me, and it is something to do with all of us. So,
are they expecting social work to, by osmosis, know about this, or the police to know about this?
Yeah, they are, and we find that not only with abuse against children, concerns for children, about everything. You see it on social media all the time. I'm not a grass. I'm not going to say the police can work that out for themselves. That's the thing. We can't. We rely heavily on the public to come to us with information so that we can then investigate it and we can step in and help.
You can't do that until you get a report of something. You've got nothing to go on, no pretext to go in.
No. We need the public to come to us.
So can you explain, Lianne, just what the process is? What exactly should people do when they're worried about a child and they think, do you know what, I think I probably need to go to the police about this, or to social services?
They can go to social services, they can go to the teacher or the police. What would happen if they went to the police, for example? That call would be logged. That person could be given an incident number if they ask for it. We will then do some immediate checks with the local social work department just to find out if they're known, the family are known to social work, if the children are already on the at-risk register. And if they are, then the police and the social work would coordinate a response. If they're not, and for example, it's a call where it's late at night, the kids are screaming, there seems to be a domestic going on in the house, the police would attend that as quickly as they could to get into that house and to check that everyone was safe and well there. If everyone was safe and well, if it was maybe an argument between mum and dad that the kids overheard, we would still pass on that information, share the information with.
Because how do you know it's not something else going on at the same time?
Exactly. Quite often people will say it's a one-off, it's just a silly argument, there's no harm done, but we don't know what's going on in that house on a daily basis. So we would share the information of the parents and the children, of the circumstances as we find them. We always have a look around the house if we can, either discreetly or indiscreetly.
Are you permitted to do that by going into a house, or do you have to ask permission to have a look around? Does it happen kind of covertly? You're sussing it out, basically. You're
sussing it out. It really depends on the people that are in the house. You know, some people are really hostile towards the police all the time, and they will immediately start saying to you, you can't come in, you need a warrant. But some families...
Is that a red flag to you when they're doing that? You're just saying, wait a minute, they don't want me to see something.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Why don't you want me to come into this house? That makes me want to come into the house. I want to find out what's going on. But some parents are fine. They don't really like us being there. They don't like us having a wander around, checking in the kitchen and things. Quite a lot of the time they just want us out the door as quickly as possible, so they let us do what we need to do. But we'd certainly document that on what's called a concern form as well. Sort of the kind of the state of the house, you know, if there wasn't much food in the house, no bedding for kids, that's quite a regular thing, isn't it? We see that quite a lot, and we'd report all that back to the social work department.
So then it's over to Elaine and her team, but meanwhile, you're not just letting go of it, are you, at that point?
If everything's okay at that time, then we can leave and we'll tell the people, the parents, look, we are going to share this information with the social work department. How do you feel about that? We always ask for their view.
Interesting. And what? Why do you do that?
Well, we've got to ask them that on the form there are certain parts we've got to complete, and one of those is, You ask that nominal for their view on their information and the circumstances being shared with social work. Occasionally people will say, I'm actually fine with that because I think I might need a bit of help.
Right.
So we can get them the help. If they're not okay with it, then we just say that, they're really not happy about this, and that gives the social worker a heads up that you might be in for a difficult time when you go and see this family. But if we do go to a home where we can see that the kids are in danger or the home is really, really not suitable for children to be living in, then we can use our emergency powers to remove them from the house. But again, we spoke about last resort. That is a last resort. What we would rather do is have a social worker come to the house, a family member to maybe step in and have the kids overnight while we get everything else sorted out. So
when you're saying either the house is in disarray or there's some, it's in a bad state, and danger, a child being in danger, what are you looking at then when you're talking about a child potentially being in danger when you enter a house?
Used needles lying around the floors. No food in the house for the children. Open fires, I know you very rarely get that. Animals that maybe are not under proper control and really we shouldn't be having them around kids. So lots of things. Or obviously the parents, drug abuse, alcohol abuse, violence, a whole host of things.
So social workers are going in and seeing this sort of thing, but are children, Helen, reporting this stuff back to you on helplines and things?
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think that going back to your point originally about perpetrators can be very manipulative, and why do members of the public that might know a bit of something don't report? I think, when we look at some of those really big cases, particularly the Sarah Sharif case, which is in front of mind for me at the minute, the step-parent were very manipulative in trying to keep workers at arm's length from finding out about what was going on for that child.
And quite plausible denial about
really
things.
Plausible denial. And when we're talking about professional curiosity, that child was then made to wear a hijab. That nervousness, that cultural nervousness about getting it wrong, being accused of racist or not religiously tolerant, that can be a real barrier for trained professionals to be more inquisitive, more curious, because it's difficult. And on the subject of children contacting us, we run Childline as part of the NSPCC. Every day a child will contact Childline every 45 seconds with what's going on for them, be that something at home or bullying or online harms. And we hear horrific situations that children are finding themselves in, from being left home alone to suffering the most appalling abuse and neglect.
How are they able to articulate that on a line where they're not even seeing somebody? Are they able to do that and find the words to explain how much, are you helping them?
Really interesting point. So we used to be just a helpline. So when it was set up by Esther Ranson back in the 80s, it was a telephone helpline. Now, over 50% of the contacts that we get are young people messaging us. So they're able to articulate, perhaps through texting, typing, etc., rather than having to use their own words. And sometimes that's easier, particularly for boys, we've seen. So giving them that opportunity to message us and have live chat can be a way of a child telling somebody when they wouldn't want to verbalise it.
So that's some progress then, isn't it? That maybe they can be more candid, Elaine, because you're not in front of somebody or your voice isn't breaking and you're having to excavate the words from your soul to say what's happening in your life. Do you think there is some progress there with the technology? We always hear such bad things about the tech.
I think the important thing is to try to communicate with children or young person the best way that you can. And we have lots of challenges. We have young people with disabilities that struggle to even communicate, never mind through tech. So I think this is partly, the skill of working with young people, isn't it? It's actually about being able to adapt to whatever circumstances there are. And, I remember working with some young people and it was clear that they weren't going to talk to me in a family setting. It just didn't feel right. I had to take them to McDonald's. And if you had a burger in a different setting, you would have a very, very different conversation, and they would see you in a slightly different light than just a social worker or just a health visitor. So I think that's one of the skills I think that, people don't appreciate when you're working with children in general terms, but in this field, you've got to be quite skilled in terms of communication and being able to understand where that child is coming from and the best way to talk to them about any issues that they have of concern.
we can be quite critical of services like social services and always point out what's gone wrong. And you were talking there about, you have to have really good judgment and know the right way to approach things. Do you think that professional social workers are getting enough training and know enough about this field? Because they're being asked to go into very, very delicate situations and make huge judgment calls that have, I'm saying massive now, there are all these superlatives, massive ramifications for somebody's life.
Yeah, I think training and support for social workers is really important. And, if you're just coming out of college and you haven't got that worldly experience, you need an awful lot of support to be able to deal with this, as you do in any field. It's not just social work, it's across the board. So the importance of good supervision, going with colleagues into situations, if you're newly qualified or not long out of college, and being able to go into a household that's quite antagonistic towards you and say, look, I really need to see that bedroom because I'm worried about your child saying that they can't sleep at night. Have you got the right bedding, etc.? And some won't do that. We do have legal powers to be able to do that if we can't do it. But it's much better if you can form some sort of relationship and do it in a joint way that they feel they're going to get support from that. But I think all of these are skills that I think people don't always understand.
And talking about relationships, what is the relationship like with the police? And maybe you can tell us how you see it from your end as well, Lianne. So you clearly have to work in concert with what they're doing as well. There's a sort of structure to this. You don't just go in as one agency.
I think joint working with the police and with health is really good. And in Scotland, I think we've been making great strides in this area. And each area has a child protection committee. And on it, they have all the key statutory agencies, the police at senior level, but also that joint working on the ground, people knowing each other, being able to support each other, talk to each other. And sometimes it's informal discussions as well as that formal reporting that Lianne talked about before. That's really important. So I don't think you can underestimate the importance of those relationships at both the strategic level and also on the ground at the operational level as well. That's really important. But I think, and certainly in my area, that's really strong, and we do work together. And we have disagreements, don't get me wrong. There are things that people think, well, different ways of approaching, but you come to a negotiated position and you operate in the best interests of the child always.
Lianne, how do you see the relationship? Does it sound similar to you? The sort of, you have to work in tandem with social work and health workers as well? Yeah,
I agree with that. You absolutely have to. We can't do it on our own. We all need to be, I suppose, singing from the same hymn sheet. And we aren't always, and we do, as you say, we do have professional disagreements, but we get there in the end and we do the right thing in the end. And in my experience, in any of the divisions I've worked in, I think the relationship between the police and the social work department has always been really, really strong. I've not had an awful lot of interaction with health.
I was just going to ask you about that, because that's somewhere which is a portal to something going wrong, isn't it? You get a snapshot of something that might need to be flagged up in a criminal way. Yeah.
We don't, certainly in the area of business I'm in, we don't, have an awful lot to do with health, but that's because our inquiries are very, very historic. But if you're in divisional child abuse investigation unit, you'll know the social worker and the detective sergeant for that unit are speaking to each other on a daily basis, several times a day. So they do form a really, really close, strong working relationship.
I've got some members of my family that work in the healthcare system, and they say they see things and they're just like, they suspect, yet they're still struggling to take that step, Elaine, to make it formal. That's what they see it as, because they're just thinking, well, they're not even thinking I might lose my anonymity. They think I might get it wrong.
Mm-hmm. People are hesitant, aren't they, even in the professional world, and we've been talking about communities as well. So if we've got that hesitation there, you can see why communities sometimes struggle with that. But there is a legal duty to share information actually at professional level. If you have concerns about people,
do you think people realise that? And is it emphasised enough?
I think certainly we would emphasise it, but I think even then there's sometimes that reluctance, and it's the tipping over between what is acceptable risk and what is risk that can't be tolerated or you're concerned about. But I think if you share that risk and you share that conversation, you always get a better outcome for the child and the young person. So I would just encourage people, if in doubt, have a conversation. Yeah, really important.
And I think what we've heard is really the gold standard of what it should be like. But what we
it's
hear
not.
routinely from, when we look at child deaths and safeguarding practice reviews is that doesn't always happen. And many children will slip through the net because of the lack of joined up working, the lack of capacity, particularly in the social care workforce, where very newly qualified staff are being given very difficult cases, lack of supervision, too big caseloads. And how can you hope to be able to protect?
Too much,
Absolutely.
Helen.
We've got a system
crazy?
that's really, really struggling to cope. And we've called, for a long time now, greater investment in frontline services, but also in early help. We're dealing with crisis which could have been sometimes averted. And if we wrapped support round families at an earlier point, we wouldn't see some of the cases that we do.
We know early intervention is absolutely key, and yet it still doesn't happen or can't happen because of resourcing. So what do we do?
Exactly. We keep pushing and we campaign and we talk to our elected members and let them know that this is, because fiscally it makes sense too, because we're always plugging the gap at the other end. But also, from a rights perspective, children have the right to be happy and safe and looked after and nurtured in an environment that's supportive. They get the right education, clothing, all of that sort of good stuff. We're letting them down as a society if we don't provide that. That's not just about an individual family. We talked about the cost of living crisis. If we look at the definition of neglect, many of the families at the NSPCCs are struggling to feed their children, to have a warm home, to have the right sort of bedding, etc., etc. Now, are we saying that that's neglect? Because, well, yes, it is. But
is it willful neglect?
Absolutely.
That's the point.
So we're looking at systems change, not just individual families having to be responsible.
Elaine?
I think we also have to acknowledge that there are resource issues and training issues which I think people are grappling with, and I think in Scotland we kind of are trying to do as much as we possibly can. But I think we also have to hold on to the fact that we do actually support and protect a lot of children
right.
every day.
Tell us
so
the good stuff that we don't.
The cases that Helen's just outlined are the ones that absolutely we don't want to happen and do go wrong, but you've got to counterbalance that with the amount of good work that goes on with people as well and children. So just to put that into perspective.
So there is good work going on, and we're in danger of seeing this as all completely negative and all about, we haven't got enough resources. We can't fight this thing. It's too big. It's way too big for us. But what it boils down to quite often is a very simple thing, and it is a gut feeling, isn't it, that you sense something is not quite right. And that takes quite a leap of faith to then go in some capacity or report it in some capacity and say, no, this is a thing. It's not just a suspicion. I think this is a thing. You need to investigate it. How do we get the gut feeling, I'm opening this up to the three of you, to make that step and say, right, because I've got that gut feeling, I can't let that go away. That's going to be gnawing at me until I do something about it. How do we do that?
As members of the public who have the gut feeling.
And professionals as well that maybe don't want to admit, that they're troubled by it and it keeps coming back to gnaw at them.
I've had friends that have said to me, I just think something's not right with my daughter's friend, my son's friend. I don't want to get involved. I don't want to go to court. I don't want any of that. I would just say to them, that child might not have a voice. You might be the only voice for them. So you have to speak up. And it might be that nothing's happening. And if nothing's happening, the child's safe, then there's no real harm done. But it might be that there is something going on. And by you speaking up, we can then intervene and then it stops. Now, we don't always get the result we want. And I suppose for the police, not to sound cold, but for us, it's about a conviction at the end of it.
You need a result.
We need a result. We don't always get a conviction at the end of it. But if we get in and the abuse stops for that child and the child is removed from that situation and they're then safe and well, that's a good result.
And I think hearing from adults who have lived with abuse and neglect and the impact that it's had throughout their lives, and then that one person stepped in and did something and spoke up for them and that abuse stopped and their life trajectory changed forever, that's enormously powerful. And we're very fortunate at the NSPCC to have a number of people that will support our work by talking about their own lived experience of abuse and neglect as a child and the things that people did or didn't do. And you get one of those people in a room full of people. And I think most people at the end of that would think, I need to do the right thing, because it's really, really powerful.
So I'm tingling just hearing that, because I'm thinking it's all about the individual and the story, because we're talking about the generalities, we're talking about statistics, but we're talking about people's lives. And if you get somebody who's going to articulate what it meant when somebody put a brake on something awful happening to you or a sibling or somebody you cared for, that's humongous, isn't it? That's a really big deal, Elaine.
Yeah, I think that's really important. We've got to hear people's stories and the impact this can have. And I think if people understand that, they will perhaps come forward a little bit more, and more forthcoming. I just wanted to mention an approach in Scotland called Getting It Right for Every Child, GERFEC, it's called in short, which is, I know
right.
it sounds, but I think that's an important approach in Scotland. It's about getting it right for every child. And it's the level below child protection where if there are concerns about any child, there's a meeting called perhaps with teachers or health or whatever that can put in that early support and intervention to prevent it happening. I just wanted to mention that because I think from a professional point of view, it's something that's really important. And I think it's an approach that works really well as well in Scotland. It makes people get and have those conversations much, much more. You can create a team around the child who could all be supporting. It might be a teacher, it might be the health visitor working closely together. And you can do that without the legal parameters of being child protection. And if we can get there for everybody, we might prevent a lot more of this happening and a lot more of the impact on children that Helen was just talking about.
And we're talking about, when ordinary civilians fail to speak up and stop something happening. But and I'm not picking on you, but you're so experienced, I need to use your experience here. There are anecdotal stories that even social workers with the best intentions in the world can fail to act on signs that something is really wrong. Why does this happen? Is it really all because it's inexperience or lack of training? What's going on? Or is the picture becoming more complicated as well?
I think the picture's becoming really complicated. The cases that I think we're dealing with are much, much more complicated than perhaps they were when I started off in my early social work, professional work. I think there can be a whole raft of reasons about it. I think one of the things for me is about, I call it the jigsaw, but actually social work might have a little bit of the picture, but actually health have got another bit, the public have got another bit, police might have another bit. If we don't put the jigsaw together, then nobody has the full picture. Lianne was just mentioning, going to court is a big, big step, and you need a very, very full picture to be able to take that. If you only got half the story or a quarter of the story, people are denying it, then you're not in a very good position to do that. So I think that sometimes it's about, have we got the whole story? Have we got all the information? And that's why everybody working together is really important. But I think that, social workers having time to reflect on the cases and not just rushing in and out of people's houses.
That's the reality.
But I think we try and build as much as we possibly can in. I think some of the cases are demonstrating we could do better. I think that social work as a profession are very, very clear that should be in place. And I know for newly qualified social workers in Scotland, a lot of places have a very protected caseload and very good supervision to try to prevent that happening. But you're right, you can only do what we can do within the resources that we have available.
And looking at the broader landscape, Lianne, I think you said you've been with the Cots for about 20 years. Is it?
25.
25, just the 25.
Yep.
Okay.
Nearly there.
Nearly over that finishing line. How have things changed in terms of protection for people that are getting abused? Do you think we're on an upward trajectory, or are you worried about the way it's going? I'm
not worried, no. I think I've seen a big change since I joined the police. Because I deal a lot with sexual crime, we now have many, many resources that we can deploy to a victim of sexual crime. One of those is a sexual offences liaison officer, and that would be the officer that's assigned to the victim.
That's a dedicated officer?
Dedicated officer to take their statement, to go with them to Archway that we have here in Glasgow, which is the Sexual Assault Referral Centre, to keep them updated all the way through the inquiry, with how we're doing with the inquiry, meet with them along with their rape crisis worker, for example. I know that most of the time we're doing it a lot better because we have these dedicated officers and we have more knowledge. We're better trained now than we were 20 years ago. When I was a young cop I don't even think I was out of my probation, so I had less than 2 years, and I was sent to interview an 8-year-old girl, a victim of a sexual crime. I didn't have a clue what I was doing.
There was no manual for you to do that.
There was nothing, but but my supervisor thought that was appropriate to send me to that. Whereas now, a uniformed officer would go and speak to maybe the parents or the carers of that little girl, maybe speak to her very briefly for 5 minutes before telling the specialist department, who would then come in and deal with it. I also think we were talking about people who might have a gut feeling but think it's none of my business, I don't want to get involved. I think that might be a generational thing, and I think of my own parents who had quite difficult childhoods where, you know, any perceived misbehaviour in the house was dealt with by being hit, being smacked.
Yeah.
But my mum and dad are of a generation where they think, well, it didn't do me any harm. I think that's
Keep
debatable.
hearing that mantra, don't you? Yeah.
But that's not my experience of childhood. My experience of childhood is much better. So, you know, for me, if I suspect a child is being harmed, I think, you know, that's wrong. That shouldn't be happening. But when you've got people of my parents' generation who might be the ones that are witnessing it, they're a lot more reluctant to come forward.
Just hearing you say that word harmed, we were talking about that, weren't we, Helen, before we started this conversation. How important is the lexicon of words that we use? Because I wonder if we get a little bit inured to the impact of words, like abuse victims and survivors of abuse. But if you talk about people being harmed, that to me sounds much more, I don't know, that's a subjective thing, but there's something about the word harmed that we can all appreciate. That means that's not good.
Definitely. And I think, you know, that's a really interesting comment about different generations. And I think, you know, your comment about the jigsaw puzzle as well, that's a phrase that we use quite a lot at the NSPCC, where members of the public might have that little bit of the jigsaw puzzle, and they don't need to make a judgment call about whether it needs to be referred to the police or the local authority, because that's what our trained professionals will do. So that bit of the jigsaw that you think you might have, report it to us and then let somebody else decide. So you're not having to make that. You don't need to be a child protection specialist to be able to report your concerns. And I think we've got a generation now of members of the public that are happy to put the hand up and say, actually, that's not right, I'm going to call it out. And in some communities, that still is quite challenging.
Is that the thing that's better? Because we've heard Elaine say things have improved. We've heard Lianne say things have improved in some ways. But you're kind of doing that.
I am doing
you're
that.
Not
sure. I think for lots of children, quality of life has improved. Access to help and support is there. But for some children, that isn't the case. And we see with the rise of use of technology, AI, child sexual exploitation and criminal exploitation, I think it's a really complicated picture. And some of the most vulnerable children are still the most vulnerable children because of all of that. And perpetrators have got more sophisticated in how they're trying to reach children. And, you know, our services, our technology has got to keep up with that. And that's a real challenge.
Yeah, let me ask you, you two as well, about the AI and the sort of threat that's coming now. I mean, as I say, technology can be brilliant, but it can also pose particular problems, especially for younger, vulnerable people.
That's a big challenge that Helen has just raised there around social media, and we have concerns about children being abused online and being exploited by sharing images, for example, that then people are threatening to share with family. And it's a very, very difficult area. And I think there is a challenge for us to keep up with all of that. You know, this is probably all new to some people who are working in the field. So young people are much more savvy, I think, than some of my generation anyway, around that. So, you know, I think the police have a really good handle on being able to try to track some of this in terms of, work with that. But we do know it's a growing area and we need to be looking at it. And child sexual exploitation and cases like Rotherham, all of these things are probably new and emerging. And it's very much up to professionals and to agencies to try and think about ways of dealing with that, which probably wasn't 10 years ago or 20 years ago, the way that things were perceived. So I would agree with Helen that I think there's some things that we are improving with, but we can never be complacent and we don't always get it right. But I think I just want to hold on to the fact that we're still really working hard with a lot of families and young people to try and keep them safe, and the focus is still there. And this is one of the challenges for professionals and training, isn't it? How do you know how to deal with this? You need to be kept up to date all the time. So there's that ongoing training and support that's required for people. And I guess for the public as well, how do they know that's happening?
It. We've got our role to play as well. Maybe we'll
Yeah.
talk about that in a minute. But how do the police keep a pace with this, with all the stuff that's going on? Your eyes are crossing.
Not my area of expertise, and I think you're speaking to one of the detective sergeants from the online child sexual exploitation department tomorrow.
Indeed.
That department, they are next door to me at Vigilant House in Paisley, and I have never seen a department that is busier in my whole 25 years in the police.
So policing is really changing.
Really changing. They are getting packages daily with intelligence of people online and sharing indecent images of children, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. I don't envy anyone working in that field because it is a minefield, really, really difficult to navigate. But I think the teams that I've seen that deal with that are really young, dynamic, enthusiastic officers who understand the technology. I'm not great with it, and they are being trained regularly, refresher training regularly, to keep on top of it. Very difficult though.
Yeah, it's an emerging threat, and we don't know where it will end up. But let's sort of, now look at what the possible solutions are. And we've talked about some of them. And let's try and, keep things in perspective about what the limitations are in terms of money, spending, whatever. Say you had, for example, Scottish Justice Minister or the Home Office Minister or Home Secretary here. Just wonder what you'd all want to say to them about basically a plea to make sure that people report more what they worry about. Is there one particular measure or one thing you'd like to have their ear to say, if there's a thing you do before you leave office, this is what you ought to do? I know that's really unfair. I've landed that on you. But come on, 40 years of experience, Elaine, maybe you can start us off.
You were saying you didn't want to talk about resources
and
training.
Fair enough. If it is resources, then it has to be said that this won't be fixed unless they start giving proper resources. And what does that even mean?
I think there's definitely something about resources, making sure we have social workers coming through the system that are well educated, well able to deal with these pressures. We know that it's interesting, I think, in the children and families world, that actually it is often the newly qualified workers that go into there, and some of the more experienced workers move their way through to working with adults. And of course, there's still challenges in adults, don't get me wrong, in terms of abuse for adults. But I think we would always want to make sure there was plenty of staff. They were well supported. They weren't going out of the service because there was too much pressure and stress. So we need to make sure that caseloads are reasonable, that people have the right professional support,
retaining
them, not just recruiting them. So my message would be, how can you help us to do that in terms of that whole area of future-proofing the professional service, I think, that we provide,
And while we're on that, when we're saying retaining, what about attracting people to the profession? Because, my gosh, this is a really tough sell, isn't it, to get people to want to do social work, given that they know what the strictures are and the public opprobrium when something goes wrong. Bit like the cops. But anyway.
No, I think that's important, and that's why I think we need to have an honest dialogue and debate about the good things that are happening. We don't hear the voices very well of people who have got the right support, who've had their lives changed around, etc. And we need to balance that with focus on the cases like the Glasgow case that have gone wrong, because otherwise we won't attract people into the profession. They'll just say it's too risky. Why am I going there? But there is such a lot of positive satisfaction you can get from working in this field. I've been a social worker for 40 years, and there's something about just getting that relationship with young people, feeling like you've made a big difference in their lives, feeling like you can talk to them. And I've had a number that have said to me, look, that was a really difficult decision you made, but I welcome that. It's turned my life around, and I really welcome that. So we need to get those stories out as well as the ones that are focusing on the things that have gone wrong.
Leanne, what about you? If you have the ear of the Home Secretary or the Scottish Justice Minister or whatever.
What would I say to them?
Is it going to be resources?
Yeah, it will be resources. Yeah. It'll be give us a decent wage, make it a more attractive career for people, employ the right people. Because I think if we have the right people doing these jobs and we have enough people, then we can do more. We have less absence because cops are going off sick with the stress. I mean, the subject matter we're talking about today is really, really grim. It can really, being exposed and absorbing people's trauma all the time can have quite a negative effect on your own mental health.
How's it affected you?
How's it affected me? It's made me very suspicious of lots of people. I have a 16-year-old daughter who, I have to say, she'll hate me for saying this, she's probably quite naive, and I think that's my fault, because she's been brought up by police officers. We wrap her in cotton wool. We see danger everywhere, absolutely everywhere. But
because you know what can go wrong.
Because I know what can go wrong. And, I'm quite confident that in my family and my friend group it's not going to go wrong. But then the amount of women and men that I've spoken to have said, I trusted that person with my child. I didn't think anything like this would happen. So it makes you think, well, if it could happen to her kids, it might happen to me. Yeah, it really does have an impact on your mental health. But I have to say, my experience of when I've put my hand up and said I'm struggling a little bit has been in the main positive with the police, but that's not the case for some officers. So I think if we're going out and doing that job and absorbing people's trauma, witnessing it, then we need to be looked after better so that we can continue to do a good job, because everyone that I know that works in child protection have a real passion for protecting children. Everyone would agree that you don't do this if you don't want to do it. So,
and you do it for satisfaction of knowing that you're doing a good thing, a right thing. And let me ask you about when you do see a report in the news and you've got somebody nailed for something. How does that feel? How does the team take it?
It feels fantastic. And you talked about the Glasgow case that's been in the press. A couple of the officers in my department worked on that in its infancy. So that's a great boost for them, that the hours of hard work and the sadness behind it has resulted in convictions and pretty good sentences.
Does that make it worth all the angst that it's caused you, this job? Because it does cost.
Yeah, it does make it worth it, but I think I'm not alone in saying that there are some children that you just never ever forget in your career. There are still some that I remember from 20 years ago, and I wonder, where is he now? Is he okay? Did we make a difference? So yeah, it really it can have that effect on you. It's not easy, but it's very rewarding, as Helen said.
Okay, so that's two of you have said that more or less the same thing. It's not easy, but it's very rewarding, right, Helen?
Yeah, I think I'm the opposite. I've got an 18-year-old that's just gone off to university this year, and for me, I think I come with this perspective that most people are good. Actually, most adults do the right thing by children, and through our work, certainly in communities, through our local campaigning activity, we see people that want to do the right thing through professionals, from social workers, health visitors, the police, multi-agency teams that are doing the right thing, through to members of the public. So I think keeping that sense of proportionality is really, really important. But I think if I was asking kind of senior people what to do, I would say ensure that the ICSA recommendations are properly
Explain
implemented.
what ICSA is.
Sorry, the Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse. We had so many people coming forward and talking about their experience at the hands of various people that had sexually abused them. Really important that their voices are heard, acted upon, and the system improved because of that, not because of a political debate that's going on from America with Elon Musk and etc. talking about grooming gangs. So I think that's really, really important that we focus on the lived experience of people in this country who've been through the system and know what needs to change. But also about the Online Safety Act. I think it's really important that the government implement that. We have a really robust regulatory system where social media companies are held to account for what is happening on their platforms, where children are being exposed to all sorts of online harms, and those companies, there's no pushback.
You've done it now. You mentioned the M word. Musk has...
Apologies.
He's certainly... you can debate the rights and wrongs of him doing it, but is it in a way interesting, stroke possibly good, that we are even talking about this stuff more openly again, because it comes in and out of the news cycle? That's the way we are as human beings. What's the feeling around the table, starting with you?
For me, it can be a distraction, I think, because we know that children are being sexually exploited by grooming gangs, yes, and you mentioned Rotherham. There's loads of other different places right across the UK where children have experienced those harms. But every day we know that abuse within the home, familial sexual abuse, happens much more than the grooming of children by gangs. And I think, those children's voices need to be heard. And that's much less palatable to the general public when you say it's in your home. It's not out there. It's not by someone that you don't know. It's in your home.
Leanne?
Yeah, I agree with that, what you just said there. I think the abuse of children in the home is much more prevalent, but you're right, it's not palatable to most people. People don't want to hear it, they don't want to talk about it or accept it.
But they need to face it.
But they have to face it because it's happening every day.
How do we make them more aware of it?
Way.
How do we make them even bother when they hear it? It's so difficult. It's a huge societal problem.
Yeah, it really, really is. And I know sort of some older people in my family, if they ask about work and what did you do, if I start to explain something, and even the most minor of crimes committed against children, they go, I don't want to hear it. I don't want to hear it, So
we need to hear it.
We need to hear it. And, if these are the people that some of the time we are hoping will report concerns for children, what hope is there? I know that's really, really negative.
Over to you, Elaine. The Musk question. Is it good that we're even having the debate, or is it a huge distraction?
I think it's just a huge distraction, really, and you get into the debate about Musk and American politics, which isn't actually very helpful whatsoever. So I think, that hasn't been helpful. I think there's enough in the press to raise the issue about, children at risk and child abuse. We do need to have that open dialogue. We do need to be talking about it more, and we do need to be talking to the public about how they raise any concerns as well as hearing children and young people's voices as well. The two areas I think that we haven't touched on very much, and I just wanted to sort of recognise, is the important role of education in schools. They do a really good job. They all have safeguarding officers, and I think that's changed a lot in recent years. And I think, again, teachers have a huge protective element, and they're very good at being able to talk to children as well about things that might be going on. So I wanted to
they know them. They've got a bit of knowledge of their background.
Absolutely. And again, I think they should be credited for some of the work that they do. And the other thing I just wanted to mention was the third sector as well. They have a tremendous amount of resources that support children and young people. Perhaps if there's been abuse identified, that they do work with them, like the NSPCC, to support them and find a way through that and counsel them, etc. And some really good advocacy services as well for children and young people that are around that help them express their voice. So I think we need to be raising the profile, but we need to be also working with the agencies all around and the people that can help us to do that more effectively.
Well, thank goodness you three are all doing it in your own way. Very, very grateful to you all. Thank you so much for coming in and talking about something which is so important. What is it that's stopping us from reporting? And the message would be, Helen, just tell people what to do if they even suspect there's something.
So just do something. If it's not you, then who is it going to be? So contact your local authority, Children's Services Department, the police, or indeed the NSPCC helpline, which you can contact anonymously and confidentially.
So I would say people who are saying, what if I'm wrong? You need to ask yourself, what if I'm right, and how I can support that child.
Lianne, have you got an add-on? You might as well.
I can't top that, no. Just can't.
Going to leave it there. Over to everyone listening to this. Thank you so much.